How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Keeping the Faith podcast. I am your host, Jonathan Fuentes. This is my co-host, Edgar Martinez.
Hello, guys.
All right, so as Edgar mentioned last week, we will be doing separate videos or separate podcasts, just us individually. I think this is a good idea, kind of gives us a little break, but without stopping the episodes, because we want to be able to give content, because we know that there are listeners who like listening to it every week, and we don't want to stop recording episodes altogether. So this is a nice idea that Edgar had, that we can do it this way, and I think it's really good because we're going to be able to cover topics this way that maybe might be too short for a podcast, because we do like to have a certain time limit when we're doing a podcast. You know, we don't want to be too short, but we don't want to be too long. But in the sense where we're doing these by ourselves, these podcasts, we can talk on certain subjects that might be too short for its own podcast episode. So if you guys didn't listen to Edgar's last week, I recommend that you guys do, because he did talk about the Bible, you know, our dusty old Bibles, and it's a good reminder for all of us that we could all use. But this week, I do want to talk about a certain subject, because this podcast is called Keeping the Faith. You know, point of the podcast is to help us keep our faith. You know, we're going to be facing a lot of things in life that are going to try destroying that faith or try to make it waver or sway to the side. And it's just important to be able to stay firm in God and to stay firm in His Word and His promises and on Jesus. And the thing is, that's why I want to talk about this subject, because the biggest issue that we're going to face as Christians a lot of times is the idea of sin. Now, even though sin is a big subject, and maybe on the podcast we'll dedicate a whole episode to this, but I do want to talk about one Bible verse in particular that's often brought up a lot. One of the Bible verses that I learned almost right away, that I still, you know, tell myself to this day. And it's 1 Corinthians 10:13. For those of you guys who don't know it, it's actually funny because this is my second time trying to record this episode, and I should have pulled it up, but I didn't. And I said that in the last episode. I was like, man, I should have pulled it up. Anyways, for the most part, it says something along the lines of, God will never allow us to be tempted more than we can handle. And when we are tempted, you know, He'll always provide, or He'll show us that way out to get out of the temptation. Before we actually dive a little deeper into the verse, I do want to clear up one misconception that people have about this verse. And there's actually a verse that out there that, or people think it's a verse that says, God will never allow us to handle. No, God will never give us things more than we can handle, or allow us to go through things more than we can handle. And, you know, you hear that verse and you're like, oh, that's a nice verse. You know, you think it's a promise of God, but then what happens? You know, life happens, and you realize that you are experiencing something that is too much for you to handle. And then you're like, oh, God, like, where were you? You start blaming God, and you start blaming God. Where were you? Why weren't you there to help me? This was more than I can handle. But then when you try to look for that Bible verse, you realize that's not even there. And this is the verse that actually people are misquoting when they say that, because the Bible says that God will never allow us to be tempted more than we can handle, not that He'll never allow us to go through things that we can handle. And it's just important that we know that, because when we don't know Bible verses correctly, we blame God. You know, in an instance where I hear that verse incorrectly, and then life happens, and I feel like I'm drowning, and I feel like there's nothing I can do, and I'm just like, you know, clinging for help. You know, I'm like, God, where were you? So it's just important to really know the Bible verses. But I do want to talk about this one. Like I said, I just want to address that really fast, because that is misquoted a lot of times by people. But let's talk about the idea of God will never allow us to be tempted more than we can handle. The reason I bring this up is because, like I said, sin is such a big deal in the lives of Christians. However, the thing is, a lot of times when it comes to sin, we know what we struggle with. We know what we have a hard time being in the presence of, not being in the presence of. I mean, if we used to be alcoholics and we struggle with being around alcohol, we know that we struggle with alcohol or drugs or women or money or gambling or whatever it is. As individuals who seek to live a life that glorifies God, we should be aware of the things, our weaknesses in a sense. But a lot of times, even keeping that in mind, we still think ourselves to be Superman. You know, we tell ourselves, you know what? I know that I struggle with alcohol, but I'm just gonna go to the bar with my friends. I know I struggle with getting drunk. I guess more specifically, I'm still going to go to the bar with my friends, but I'm just not going to get drunk, and we tell ourselves that, but yet we still put ourselves in a position to allow the enemy to tempt us, and we're like, oh, well, right before I get drunk or right before I have a drink, I know I'll be strong enough to say no. And the truth is, that's never the case. Especially when we're dealing with sin that we've been struggling with for a while. What happens is, whenever we're in the moment of dealing with that battle, I'm going to keep using alcohol just because it's an example that I think we can all kind of see what's happening. Let's say you're working and the very first time your friend's like, hey, we're going to the bar after work. That's like the very first step. That's like the very first opportunity to get out of there. The Bible says that that God will show us the way out. Right there is the way out. Right there, when you first are exposed to a thought, when you're first exposed to a conversation, when you're first exposed to the idea, that's the way out right there. Like I said, we should be alert and sober-minded of what our weaknesses is. So when that first thought comes, we should be able to escape it. Obviously, we do have to rely on God for His strength, but the thing is, that's the way out right there. But what happens, like I said, we consider ourselves supermen or superwoman, and it's like, oh, well, yeah, I'll go, and we go, and then what ends up happening? We end up getting drunk, and then we end up sinning, and we end up letting God down. So what happened? Well, here's the thing. From the very moment that seed of temptation is planted or dangled in front of us, it starts to grow roots in our heart. It starts to grow roots. It gets planted. The more the idea begins to grow, the roots start to get deeper into our heart. So that way, when it is time to make a decision, what happens? Those roots are so strongly buried into our hearts, into our mindset, that when we have to make a decision, we're going to make the wrong decision. And then the thing is, then we'll start blaming God. God, why didn't you show me a way out? The way out was in the beginning, before those roots took place in our heart. And we need to be aware of that. Another example, and I'm going to say it just because it's so prevalent to the time, is, women and, lust and stuff. If you're on, let's say, Instagram and women are posting pictures of who know what of themselves, that's your way out. It's like, you're neutral. You see the pictures and you're like, I got to get out of here. I got to close Instagram. I got to get out of here. That's God allowing that door for you to get out of there. But what happens? You're like, oh, well, whatever. It's just Instagram. I'll just keep going through the pictures. And then that seed gets planted. And then you go on your day and you start thinking about it. Those roots are growing. And then you keep thinking about something else. And then those roots are growing. And then by the time you know it, those roots are so grounded and so rooted into your heart that you have an opportunity to, sleep around or to cheat on your wife or to look at porn. And since those roots have already been rooted into your heart, you're not going to say no. I mean, obviously all things are possible through Christ. Don't get me wrong. But at that point, we're kind of just playing with it. It's like, hey, God, I know I struggle with alcohol or with women. I just want to get as close as possible to before I start sinning, and I know I'm going to be strong enough to get out. And that's never the case. And I think in a sense, it could be looked at that way, where it's like we're just messing with God, or we're messing with His grace. We're trying to take advantage of His love. And, in reality, when we try taking advantage of grace and we try taking advantage of God's love, we're not receiving it. I mean, it's to put it plain and simple, we're just not receiving any of that stuff because we are trying to play with it. But I think this is just something that I want to talk about, because the truth is, whenever we struggle with something for so long, the lines can start to blur. The enemy can start to whisper in our ear that, oh, you know what, this is just part of you. You're just an alcoholic. You're just a gambler. You're just a lustful person. And you can start to believe it, and you're like, man, now, like, there's, I've tried to stop, I've tried to get better, and nothing happens, and God stopped helping me. But the truth is, God is still providing that way out. He's still showing that door is wide open. But like I said, instead of cutting it off right away, we allow it to take root, and we consider ourselves to be strong enough to be able to stop it once those roots have already been rooted into our hearts. And like I said, unfortunately, that's just not the case. And I think we need to be aware of that. We need to be so reminded. The door will be there. God is faithful to always show us the way out and to not allow us to be tempted more than we can handle. That's the thing. That's the thing that we have to remember. Even in those moments where we are feeling tempted, God's saying, look, you can handle this. You can rely on my strength enough where you can see the door and you can get out of it. But because of the evilness and the wickedness that we have inside of us, we don't want to cut it off at the root. We don't want to stop it. And I think, like I said, if we truly sit down and reflect and talk to ourselves and say, look, God, I do want to live a life that glorifies you. I do want to honor you with my life. God, as soon as I see that door, I pray, God, that you fill me with the strength to be able to walk through it. Because even when I do see the door, I still struggle because of the evil that's inside of me, because of the bad that wants to come out. Like James tells us in James 1:13-15, it says the reason that the enemy is able to tempt us is because that evil is already stored in our hearts. You know, the devil, the enemy, however you want to call him, he doesn't force us to do anything. He just dangles something in front of us, and because of our greedy nature or our lustful nature or our, prideful nature, we want to do it. But he's not forcing us to do anything. And in moments like this, it's when we need to cling to God more. And, like I said, when we dedicate ourselves, when we wake up in the morning and say, God, give me strength, help me to see the door. As you go on through your day and you see the door, if you allow yourself to be sober-minded in that position, like I said, we should all be aware of our weaknesses, but you allow yourself to continue throughout your day sober-minded, you're going to see that door, and all it takes is just one cry, just, Jesus, help me, fill me with your strength. I feel the temptation already, and I want to stop it right here before it grows roots. That's where the door is, and that's what we need to walk through. Like I said, as Christians, we're all going to struggle with different things. Some people, I gave some examples. But like I said, we need to be sober-minded and we need to be aware of where that door is, when that door is presenting itself. And if we're playing with it, if we're messing around with sin or the idea of being tempted, all it's doing is growing roots. So when you're in the middle of that position, in that situation where you have to make a decision, most likely you're going to make the wrong one. But it's because you allowed it to get there, not because God abandoned you, not because God's love and God's strength wasn't sufficient, but because you allowed it to get to that point. And like I said, the reason I'm saying this is just because we need to be more aware of it. We need to be more alert. So that was today's podcast. I hope that, like I said, the whole idea of this podcast is keeping the faith. Sin is such a big thing that prevents us from keeping the faith. Because that's exactly what it tries to do. It tries to, sin tries to get in between our relationship between us and God. And the more times that we sin, the more separated we're going to feel from God. So, there's no better way of keeping the faith than not allowing sin to take root and to, grow fruit into our lives. So I hope this episode was useful for you guys. I hope you guys learned a lot. Like I said, we're always here for you guys. If you guys want to message us, if you guys want to leave us comments, you guys can do that on our Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook. We're always posting daily Bible verses and other stuff. Any updates that we have on the ministry, you guys can feel free to check them out there. Or just leave us a comment on our YouTube channel. We really much appreciate it. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. I hope you guys have a great night. Take care, and God bless.